What up everybody? I'm Dylan with Magickal Chams here. Today I am going to show you how to build a bioactive vivarium. Now you might be asking, what is a bioactive vivarium? Essentially it's creating a self-sustaining environment for any sort of reptile that you plan to keep in that environment. So the difference between a bioactive environment and a live planted environment is that the bioactive environment has what's called microfauna, such as isopods and springtails within the substrate that act as custodians or cleanup crew that maintain the cleanliness of that environment. Now what these guys do is they clean up rotting plant matter, they clean the roots of the plants, they get rid of any mold, and eventually any reptile feces. So this doesn't mean that you'll never have to take care of cleaning this environment or maintaining this environment because it's self-sustaining. You still have to go ahead and clean the plants off where, you know, maybe some fecal matter touched, so on and so forth. And bioactive environments are a beast of their own. So I highly recommend that you have your reptile husbandry down before trying to go bioactive. When you go bioactive, you have to make sure you maintain enough food for the microfauna. You have to make sure that you understand how the plants work, like what their care needs are, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of other research that I encourage you to do. Again, I'm here to show you how to build a bioactive vivarium and not explain to you how to maintain one. I'll go ahead and leave some links in the description of the video that you can look into and see what it takes to maintain a bioactive environment. So please be aware that I am by no means an expert on the subject. There's plenty of other sources, YouTube videos, people who have done bioactive vivariums for much longer than I have. I just want to share my experience and some of the research I've done so that you guys can have some sort of foundation to go from with looking into and maybe even going bioactive. So one last suggestion here. If you plan to create a bioactive vivarium, just think about what reptile you're going to have in that enclosure before creating that enclosure. Based off of the husbandry needs of whatever reptile you plan to keep in there, the setup and the design is going to be a lot different. You know, go ahead and make some blueprints, you know, really think about how that enclosure is going to be built. So if you're thinking of a chameleon, for example, you need a lot of branches going across. You need to create what resembles like the canopies of trees, or you know, you need to create an environment that has hiding spaces, but not like a hide within a piece of cork bark. You know, how are the whatever husbandry requirements that you're going to need contrast against the plant's needs. So from here, I'm going to show you how to build this environment. I do apologize in advance that this video is very, very long, and I'm going to go ahead and do a voiceover just to kind of speed up the process here. Just based on how this turned out with the voiceover, I may just always do voiceovers in the future just because it's very concise. At least to me it is. So just hang in there and let's get to this. So to start off, I went ahead and got all of my supplies. This includes the 1836 glass Exo-Terra Terrarium, as well as some sticks, some cork bark, and a lot of other things. I'm not going to go over this extensive list here, but in the description I'll go ahead and leave a list of everything that I used in this video. First step was unwrapping the terrarium. As soon as that was completed, I went ahead and set the terrarium on its back, and then I went ahead and used some blue painter's tape to cover the vent on the front, so as I progressed throughout this build I don't get any debris in there. Then I went ahead and took these fern panels and figured out where they might go and kind of got an idea of how I wanted to design this bioactive vivarium. So you can see here that I am putting the cork bark in place and kind of putting some pots around the cork bark to kind of figure out how this is all going to fit together before I start applying silicone and foam and all that other good stuff. So once I had everything where I wanted it, I marked with blue tape where the top and bottom of the fern panels would sit on the back of the terrarium. That way, when I go ahead and silicone them in, I know exactly where they go. I vacuumed out the terrarium, and then I used some rubbing alcohol just to clean the glass's surface to make sure I have maximum adhesion for all of the pieces I'm going to attach. So after I kind of had an idea of what was going on, how I was going to do this, I went ahead and placed some 100% silicone with a caulking gun on the fern background panels and put those in place. Alright, next I'm taking Great Stuff Gaps and Cracks, and I'm using this to make the background with, and I'm going to spray that into place and kind of spray it on top of the fern panels in certain places so that it kind of holds it down. At some points I'll actually come back in and spray areas more than once and kind of fill in those areas where I think that there's air holes. So after I applied the foam, I went ahead and put some weights on those fern backgrounds just to, give them some extra support in, adhering to the glass. Now, after I let that foam cure for about 8 hours, I went ahead and got a glass scraper and a serrated blade and used both to carve out the foam. Now you might be thinking, hey, wasn't there a piece of cork bark in the middle? Well, yes, there is going to be a piece of cork bark that goes in the middle, but the reason I placed the foam first is because in the past when I've done other terrariums and tried to foam underneath the piece of cork bark, I find that I didn't apply enough foam and there was a lot of air pockets, so the piece of cork was not fully secured against the back of the terrarium. Now, thinking about pots for the terrarium, instead of just carving a pot in the foam or a little area for the, for me to put plants, I find it much easier to actually use a plastic pot or, the reusable pots that you get when you buy a plant, like at the hardware store that you typically throw away, the pot that you typically throw away. And then just drilling a hole in the bottom and then putting some aquarium tubing in there. And you'll see here that I'm drilling the appropriate size for the tubing, which I believe was a 3/8 outer diameter tubing, so thus I am drilling 3/8 inch of hole. So once I have that hole drilled, I go ahead and insert the tubing and make sure I have a lot of lead. So once I got that all finished up, I went ahead and vacuumed out the terrarium again and made sure that all the surfaces were as clean as possible. And then I went ahead and set the piece of cork bark back in the terrarium with the pot inside, and then you can see that I have a lot of tubing coming out the bottom of that pot, which is going to lead all that extra water down to the bottom substrate area of the terrarium. Anyway, so you can have the tubing exit wherever you like. I just found that the most efficient place for it would be to be near the substrate layer, so that the extra water is not dripping down the plants, and and then the chameleon or whatever kind of reptile I have in here ends up drinking that dirty plant water. It seemed like a bad idea to me, so that's why I chose to have the tubing go all the way to the bottom of the terrarium. So once I deemed that enough foam was cut and the cork was in a good place to be foamed in place, I went ahead and applied some blue tape to each end of the tubing, the aquarium tubing, so that no foam got inside and so on and so forth. Once I had that tape on each end of the aquarium tubing, I went ahead and applied some foam underneath where the cork bark will be sitting, and then I foamed around it and in some other spaces. So now it's time to prep this side of the terrarium. I went ahead and used my vacuum to get up any of the extra foam that I had cut that I couldn't take out with my fingers, to get off any extra dirt. And then I went ahead and cleaned the surface with rubbing alcohol.
So now I'm going to be using the same method as I did previously with attaching the fern panels, figuring out where I want them first, and figuring out where, you know, I want all the other decor that I'm putting in there. So a really cool thing about cork bark that I found is that if you get a large enough piece, you can actually make two pieces out of it. So you'll see here I have one big piece of cork bark, and then I went ahead and I got a jab saw and I ended up cutting it at a bias. So in other words, I cut it at an angle so that the pieces will look larger from the face than they actually are. So in other words, instead of just cutting down the center and doing a straight cut, by cutting at an angle, it makes the pieces appear larger than they are. And I figured out where I was going to put it, and then I used the same method with the pot and the aquarium tubing for the two openings on that piece of cork. And then went ahead and got some cocoa fiber liner, cut it to a random shape, and applied some silicone, and then put that in place and put some weights on top of it. Now, when using a roll like that, I highly suggest using something heavy. The peanut butter wasn't really heavy enough right here. You know, the reason I say this is because it wants to roll up, whereas, you know, since the fern background was flat, I didn't need to use something as heavy. But since the cocoa fiber liner was rolled up, it didn't really attach to the glass as well as it could have had I used something a little heavier. After I got that piece of cocoa mat in place, I went ahead and added one more piece to the bottom. Alright, so now I'm getting everything ready to foam. I had a really hard time getting a good camera angle right here, but I hope this will do. I went ahead and took the extra leads of the aquarium tubing, and I used long pieces of painter's tape to hold those up so they didn't get trapped under the foam when I put the foam inside. So a little tip I forgot to mention previously is to crinkle up some paper towels and put them inside the pots. That way foam has a hard time of seeping in through the holes in the bottom of the pots. So since the piece of cork bark on this side was a lot smaller than the one that's on the back, I didn't find it necessary to foam first, and just went ahead and placed a bag of 5-pound aquarium pebbles on top and found that worked perfectly. So once that foam cured, I went ahead and set up the terrarium on its bottom, and then I used a glass scraper to again cut out the corner, so when I turn the terrarium on the last side that I'm going to attach foam to, it would again attach very easily to that side. And I'm also taking some of the larger pieces of foam off. That way when I go to apply the foam and all the other materials to that last empty side, I am not robbing myself of workspace. You know, I don't have to cram my hands into a space that's really, really tiny to apply foam or apply any other sort of decor that I decide to put in here. So once again, I turn the terrarium on its side, and this is the last side I'll be doing. I use the same methods as the previous two sides, where I cleaned it with alcohol to prep the surface for maximum adhesion, and then placed the items where I thought I wanted them, and went ahead and used silicone on the different backgrounds, the cocoa fiber liner, the fern background, and then once I had that, I went ahead and applied the foam. So then right here, after I had that final side cure, I noticed that that main piece of cork bark that I had installed was way too big. So luckily I had another one laying around that was much better fit for this terrarium. When I attached the new piece, I put weights on top of it, like some really heavy weights or a lot of things that weigh a lot, in order for the foam to expand out the sides of the cork bark instead of pushing it upward. So the next thing I did was I started cutting away the foam with a glass scraper and a serrated blade. Now, the reason you want to make sure that you do this part is because if you don't, the silicone that you're going to be applying with the substrate to cover this foam will not have a great time attaching to that slick layer, or the skin, I like to call it, of the great stuff. And in builds I've done in the past, it's actually the silicones actually come off from the foam. So by cutting the foam, you're exposing a rough surface and some air pockets for the silicone to get into. And you'll see what I'm talking about once we get to that step. So once I had all of those areas carved and kind of gave it a jagged aesthetic, so it looks really random when I apply the silicone, I went ahead and figured out where I was going to put my branches. With the branches, what I do here is I just go ahead and wedge them into the foam, and it's a very simple process. I kind of bend the branches back a little bit before I attach the second side. That way there's some tension in the branch so it stays in place. So I chose to put the branches in at this point in the build because the last build I did, I actually applied the branches afterward, and it was really difficult to get them mounted correctly without them wiggling around and exposing the foam again, then having to go back and do patching. So even though it makes it kind of tricky to silicone this afterward, I highly recommend attaching the sticks now. The branches that I'm using here are a combination of willow branches, manzanita branches, as well as birch branches. Now I gathered these from a couple sources. Some of it was gathered from the floral department at the grocery store, some of it was gathered from the craft store, some of it was sourced locally. Now, wherever you decide to get your branches from, you want to make sure that there's no dyes or any sort of hitchhikers or anything of the such in the branches. Now, I always disinfect my branches and then bake them for a few hours at 250 degrees in the oven. I highly recommend you do the same. That way you don't get the branches installed and then find out that there's an issue with them. That could potentially harm an animal you're going to stick in this vivarium. As you'll see here, I'm using the grate foam to mount the bases of the branches and the ends of the branches, basically wherever the branches are connecting to the foam background, so that way they're not going to shift or wiggle or spin or anything like that. And then once that foam cures, after about 8 hours, I went ahead and shaved the edges of it again, just like I did with the rest of the background. And when I did this, instead of just cutting like a square shape, I tried to blend it into the background the best I could, so it looked like I had a lot of fluidity. So once I had everything carved to my liking, it was then time to apply the substrate. What I'm using here is called Dynaflex Ultra in the color brown. Now, I've already referred to this and will continue to refer to this as silicone, and I apologize for any confusion that might cause. What this actually is exterior latex sealant. And the reason I've chosen to use this is because if any of the substrate falls off from the background in the future, what will be exposed is the brown sealant. Some people theorize that anything aside from 100% silicone at this step can cause harm to any living organism within the enclosure because of the curing agent in it. I've always used this and like it better and have not seen any issues presented by using it. If you're worried about this, then go ahead and use 100% silicone at this step, but do take into account that it is clear So also consider using gray stuff Pondent foam instead of the yellow foam I used here, because the gray stuff Pondent stone is actually black in color. So I found the best way, or the best method to start applying the silicone is to start at the bottom of the terrarium. That's the right side of the terrarium in the video. The reason for this is because you'll see here that I actually have to reach my arm in very peculiar strategic ways, and if I went ahead and did the top of the terrarium or the left side of the terrarium in the video first, I would be getting silicone all over my arm. I found the best method for applying the silicone was to actually use a gloved hand. I've seen people use paintbrushes. I've actually used paintbrushes myself, and I find that the paintbrush gets all globby, and it just, it's a big mess on the paintbrush, and I just use my hand because I can use my fingers to get in all the nooks and crannies, and I can make sure that it's applied properly. It's not just sitting on top. I'm actually pushing it into the air pockets in the foam. That way it has many points of adhesion to the foam. So after applying a liberal layer of the silicone, I went ahead and applied some larger pieces of Reptibark, followed by some Eco-Earth or Cocoa Coir. Now, you could simply just use the Eco-Earth here. You do not have to use the Reptibark, and some people do not like to because they're afraid that their reptile may accidentally eat a piece, which could impact them. However, I make sure that they're very well embedded into the background because they do make it easier for a reptile to grab onto to climb that background. And when I apply that to the silicone, I make sure to press it in. Now, this is extraordinarily important because if you don't press it in, there's a high probability that that substrate that's just laying on top of the silicone will eventually flake off with all the weathering that this terrarium will get. So, for example, when I did my first one, I omitted the step of cutting, which I had mentioned before in this video, and I'm actually in the process of redoing that background right now because so much of that substrate has fallen off and the silicone has fallen off the foam. Lastly, you'll notice that I'm applying the silicone, the Reptibark, and the Eco-Earth in small sections. The reason for this is to make sure that the silicone does not start curing by the time I get to applying the Reptibark and Eco-Earth. After I completed one side, I went ahead and waited for the silicone to cure fully. I flipped the terrarium right side up and scooped out all the extra dirt in order to reuse it for the next side, which was the back. And I unfortunately did not get the back side on camera as I completed it. And then you'll see here I'm completing the last side. I go ahead and vacuum each time before I start a new side in order to make sure that that foam is as clean as possible before adding any silicone to it. So once I had all three sides done, I made sure to get off all of the extra loose dirt and use my fingers and the vacuum hose to, suck out any of the dirt from the pots, and use my finger to brush off any loose dirt and maybe spots where it just built up and is sitting there, and just to expose any parts of the foam that was not covered by silicone and substrate. From there, what I went ahead and did was I found those spots, and then I reapplied some silicone and added some more cocoa coir or substrate and just patched it up. There were some areas that had some silicone or some foam that was a result of some overspray, and simply by taking the glass scraper and running along those areas, it easily came off. Now, I was very patient with this and made sure to use the blade at like a 45-degree angle, and I found that to be the most effective, and it did not scratch the glass. And then here along the bottom and the sides, what I'll do with that glass scraper is clean up the edges from the silicone. So I didn't intend for these lines or these edges of the silicone to be that clean, because I knew I could go back and scrape them off. So this is not really necessary, but just as far as aesthetics, I wanted to make sure it looked as clean as possible. So then after I got those edges cleaned up, I went ahead and made sure that the top frame of the terrarium, where the lid will sit inside of, was also cleaned up of any silicone that was obstructing the lid from sitting in flush with the terrarium. Now, I went ahead and didn't worry too much about this when I was applying the silicone, because I wanted to make sure that all the cracks in between the foam and the top lip of that frame were covered. So just like with the silicone in the other places, I'm going to use the glass scraper and remove it from this plastic framing. However, if you choose to use the glass scraper on the plastic framing, just be very cautious that you don't put too much pressure, because the glass scraper will want to cut into the plastic in certain areas. So just go slow and be light, and this won't be as perfect as some of the other areas where the silicone was on the glass, but all we're trying to achieve, or at least all I was trying to achieve here, is enough space for that lid to fit in flushly. The next thing I'm going to do, which is totally optional, is to cover the sides. So that way, when looking at the terrarium from the outside, the foam and everything else attached to the glass is hidden from view. So it's fairly simple. You just got to clean the outside of the glass with isopropyl alcohol the same way that was done on the insides. And then I used an oil-based paint to cover those sides, and I applied that using a simple paint roller. Now, I just want to say that this looks a lot nicer and more professional having the sides covered, but again, it's totally optional whether or not you want to use this. The paint is fairly cheap, and then you can pick up the paint roller at the 99-cent store. I went ahead and got away with 2 coats. You might need to do more if you choose to do this. I would also not worry about getting it too perfect along the edges of that foam, because what you can do is use your glass scraper, as you'll see me do here, and you can use your glass scraper to clean up the edge of that painted surface. Okay, so now I'm at the point where I'm making a drainage tube. So although there's going to be a false bottom in here and some substrate and everything, if something happens and it gets overwatered, the water needs to be able to be taken out. This is 1/2 inch PVC, and what I do is I measure out the length that I need that's going to make this pipe just a bit taller than the height of the drainage layer and the substrate layer. So once I have that area marked, I mark it all the way around the pipe, and then I drill a large hole in the center of that line. Now once I have that hole drilled, I clean out any of the fray pieces, and then I use a little hacksaw, a junior hacksaw, to saw down that line. Alternatively, you could use a PVC cutter. However, I did not have a PVC cutter on hand, so I used the hacksaw instead. It really does not matter which of the two you use, as long as the line that you're cutting is straight. Now you can see that there is a notch on one end of this pipe. That side is the bottom. Now what this does is, when it's sitting on the bottom, it will allow water to enter the pipe in order to be siphoned out, but it will not allow any substrate or any of the false bottom that I'm going to put in here to get into the pipe. From there, I use some rubbing alcohol and clean the area where this pipe is going to attach in the bottom of the terrarium, and then I use a liberal amount of 100% silicone, making sure that I don't silicone over the notch. That way water can still get through. I'll let that cure for the indicated cure time on the tube of silicone, and then I went ahead and started to apply some moss using 100% silicone as well. For this terrarium, I'm probably going to end up giving it to a chameleon. So I know chameleons need some good airflow and need ventilation. So with the other terrariums I've made, the other bioactive enclosure I made, the live moss did not do well because it was not humid enough. So simply what I'm doing here is taking dried moss and attaching it in certain areas to kind of break up the redundancy of all the browns in here. The best method I found to do this was to actually break up the moss into small pieces instead of using large like mats, if you will, and then kind of applying it in the way that I did with the substrate, where I apply the silicone and then press the pieces of moss into the silicone. Alright, so the next step is to make what's going to be a barrier layer. Now a barrier layer is going to be what keeps the substrate from getting into the false bottom, where all of the extra water is going to drain to. What I'm using here is I'm using fiberglass window screen. The way I did this was by getting the interior measurements of the terrarium and adding an inch to the depth and the width of those measurements. So in other words, on each side of this barrier layer, it's going to be a ½ inch larger than the footprint of the terrarium in order for the substrate not to fall into the false bottom. I also made a little hole in that barrier layer by getting the measurements of where the drainage pipe inside the terrarium sits. So I took those dimensions and I essentially cut an X in the same place on the screen, or the barrier layer. That way the drainage pipe is still accessible through the top of the substrate layer. It is now time to insert the false bottom. In order to get the enclosure ready for the false bottom, I went ahead and used some RO water to clean out all the extra dirt and any other particles that might be sitting in the bottom of the enclosure. Now, I would recommend using some sort of water here, whether it's RO or tap water, because if you were to use chemicals, I would imagine that any residue left over from those chemicals would leach into the false bottom and cause complications for any of the plants or maybe the reptile that you plan to keep in here. So after I went ahead and cleaned it, I then used Med hydro balls. Now there's many companies that make this type of expanded clay balls. It doesn't really matter which one you decide to use. I went ahead and used 4 2.5 pound bags of the Med hydro balls. Before I inserted them, I made sure that I rinsed them off to get off any extra dust that was left on them. From there, I go ahead and insert the barrier layer, the screen that I cut just a moment ago, and make sure that the hole lines up with the drainage pipe, and then just lightly set it in there. And after that, I'm adding some ABG mix. Now you can Google an ABG mix or some sort of bioactive substrate. This was just a eclectic mixture of a couple different recipes that I found. So as long as you have all the right components and you're not going to have dense soil, that's the main thing that you're trying to achieve, so that you have the soil aerated enough for the plants and the microfauna and everything else you're going to put in there. The next step I go ahead and do is clean off all the roots of the plants that I plan to put in this vivarium. It's a very simple process. You want to make sure that you get off the majority of the dirt from these plants into the trash can so you don't plug your tub or wherever you plan to rinse these off at. And then just go ahead and try your best to get all of the previous soil off of the plant roots. From there, I go ahead and rinse off the plant roots in some RO water to get rid of any of the chlorinated tap water off of the roots. So there's a lot of controversy whether or not plants that are going into a bioactive vivarium are going to need to be quarantined before being used. Now, with other bioactive vivariums that I've made, I've not found it necessary to quarantine them for a month or however long and haven't had any issues. Some people are very ritualistic about it and swear by it, because this is one way to make sure that there's nothing wrong with the plants that might affect the microfauna or the reptile going into the enclosure. So if you do plan to quarantine, you can go ahead and put them into something such as the rehab box that I showed you guys in the fogging video. Otherwise, go ahead and put them somewhere where they can acclimate in a humid environment with a 6500K light on top. The next thing I'm doing is boiling some magnolia pods and some leaf litter. The importance to magnolia pods and leaf litter is that it will act as a food source for the microfauna once it starts to break down. Now, I simply boil them for 20 minutes and that gets rid of any hitchhikers and sanitizes them completely before I put them in the terrarium. It's now time to plant the terrarium. So unfortunately, I could not get a good angle of everything that I was planting, but I will go over what each thing is that I'm putting in here. I highly suggest that before you plant the terrarium, to do your research and understand how each of these plants grow and understand their needs. Some plants prefer a lot of light and some plants prefer low light. Some don't really have a preference and will acclimate to wherever you put them. Some of the other plants will grow up walls and act as ground cover, and some of them will droop down and act like vines and climbing surfaces. So just, as I said, do your research before and understand the plants before you put them into the terrarium so that you don't have a lot of plants dying off. I'll also add that this may not be a quick process. I actually moved around a lot of things after I had initially placed them because I liked them better where they were after I moved them. So just play around with it and figure out what looks good, and don't rush yourself. Make sure you have ample time to do this and just enjoy it. For the climbing plants such as the Ficus pumila or the Ficus panama that I have in this terrarium, I went ahead and got some 18 gauge wire, cut a small piece of it, and then bent it in half to kind of create a C or a U-shaped clip, depending on how you look at it. And then I just used that to clip the vines onto the walls. This way they start to kind of get trained into climbing instead of just gathering all over the floor and acting as ground cover. This is also the main reason I chose to use the fern panels and the cocoa fiber mat, is because it's my understanding that these climbing plants will more readily attach to those panels as opposed to the silicone and substrate covered foam. Not to say that they won't though, so just do whatever you please and see how it works for you. I got a variety of Neoregelia bromeliads, and the way I attached them was by using some gel superglue, which is reptile safe once cured. So I just simply applied some superglue onto the bromeliad and then stuck it into the terrarium and held it for about 15 seconds until it held itself in place. I also did the same method with all the tillandsias or air plants that I added to the terrarium. So for this bromeliad, I went ahead and placed it in one of the planters on the side that was created by a piece of cork bark. Now, I originally didn't plan for this particular planter to be at such a steep vertical angle, but I made it work for this Neoregelia bromeliad by just putting some sphagnum moss into that planter and stuffing a lot in there, and then putting the base of that bromeliad in the sphagnum moss. So the next thing I went ahead and did was I superglued some sphagnum moss to the bases of the Neoregelia bromeliads. Now this is not only to hide the base of the plant, but also that sphagnum moss will retain some moisture and will act as water for that plant. Since it's not actually in soil, that's a really good way to make sure that plant is well hydrated. So once I had everything planted, I went ahead and added some Spanish moss. So you don't need to add this, and it's really not that necessary. I would be just fine without it. I think it looks really cool, and it's really easy to just hang over some branches and serve as a hiding spot. So, and I also just think it really looks cool in this terrarium. The next thing I did was I went ahead and seeded the terrarium with some springtails. I had a culture that I got maybe a month prior to building this, and I went ahead and cultivated that springtail culture until there were a lot in there. And I went ahead and added some RO water to the container that they are in. And now the reason for this is because they float. So I can easily pour the springtails into the enclosure and then save the rest. After that, it was time to add some isopods. So these are zebra isopods. They were, I believe, 10 for $20 at Rainbow Mealworms. I actually ended up purchasing 10 more so that there was 20 total in this terrarium. Now when adding these, I just pour the whole thing of soil instead of picking them out, because if there's any eggs in there from maybe some springtails or some other microfauna, maybe some other isopods, maybe the person that gave it to me or sold it to me put some substrate in with the isopods that has some eggs in it, that would be really useful for this terrarium. So I want to get everything in there if that's the case. So now that the microfauna is in the terrarium, the microfauna being the isopods and the springtails, I need a food source for them. So on top of any rotting plant debris that might be in the cage from a plant trying to acclimate to the new environment, I went ahead and added some Arcadia custodian fuel. Now I've never used this and I've heard good things about it, so we'll see how it goes. On top of that, oak leaves and some other dried and sanitized leaves. And after adding the leaf litter, I went ahead and added some magnolia pods. So anyway, that's about it. After that, I went ahead and took off the tape that I had there to protect the air vent from getting any dirt in it. After that, I went ahead and got a timer for the UV light and the LED light that I have lighting up this terrarium, so that all the plants get acclimated and, you know, get rooted and stabilized in this terrarium so that I can add a reptile. So as I promised, I'm going to go over all of the plants that I used in here. Now, I did my best to identify these by the scientific name and the common name, but don't get mad if I am wrong on some of these. Alrighty, that is it. This is the finished Bioactive Vivarium. Now I'm going to give this a couple months to really acclimate so the plants can really get established and grow in. That way there will be plenty of places that will act as hydration stations, places to get shade, as well as places to hide. I highly recommend, if you do this, you allow your Bioactive Vivarium to get established before you insert an animal. That way any of the plants in there will be less likely to die because they will actually be very established once an animal is walking on them.
Alright, so that's pretty much it. If you are considering going bioactive, or you already have all the supplies and you've started to go bioactive, I highly suggest getting a glass terrarium for this. Though I have seen it done in screen, it kind of does not make sense to me because with a lot of the plants that at least I used, they require a higher level of humidity than you can attain in a screen cage. So I'm not saying that you can't do it in a screen cage, I just will suggest that it will be a lot easier for you to maintain the environment you're creating in a glass enclosure. Or if you have any questions or you want to shoot some ideas off me about your Bioactive Vivarium, then go ahead and message me. On Instagram, it's at Magickal Chams. You can also reach out via Facebook. That's facebook.com/Magickal Chams. Go ahead and shoot me a message via email. That's magicalchams@gmail.com. And then go ahead and subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it, trying to gain some subscribers so I can do a custom URL for my YouTube channel. And then go ahead and like this video. Thanks for watching and have a great day.